James, I just wanted to, I guess, kick off by looking at I guess the first time we met was when you were editing, you actually founded Luxury Briefing.
Yeah.
And to us, and certainly to myself and Chris and the business, it was one of the clearest and best and most interesting forums that we had encountered on luxury and how you looked at it, both the realities of it, but also the intangible nature, what Chris once described as the poetry of the market as well as the market itself. And really, I think from that moment, we were sort of warmed to both how you worked in that sector and also the way you approached the thinking and ideas. And I really, to kind of kick off our chat today, I was curious about your thoughts and reflections on the last 20 years while you were doing that, and also as you moved into two different things in
yes.
your life.
Well, it's been a bit of a journey, I guess. And as you know, you guys, we were just 2 or 3 years ahead of you. We started in '96, and you were 2000. But you look back, and I commented on this along the way, but we forget what a different landscape it was at the time. And I think the brands were much smaller. There were fewer of them. The world and the wealth map was much smaller, so the sort of customer base. And so much changed between, I'd say, about 95 and even 2005. And of course, we have to remember we were in a sort of dial-up world virtually at that time, which is, it's extraordinary. Here we are sort of zooming one another, and you just can't imagine or remember this world where this just wasn't sort of part of life. And that was only 2008 really that broadband sort of came in. So you started to see the big difference. But I think it's been quite interesting actually over the last few years, because inevitably over a 20-25 year period, people change as well as sort of brands. And although I'm in a different world, I still keep a connection with sort of 1 or 2 brands, and obviously sort of friends in that world. And at the start, I think it was because of that size, it was a much more personal experience, I think, in the sort of brand arena. Many of the people who had founded their brands were still around and running them, whereas now it's management teams in many cases. So the original inspiration is no longer in situ, or they're in a sort of chairmanish role or sort of whatever, or they're no longer with us. So that's been a sort of a big change. And of course, then the market and the customer base has changed. It's got a lot younger. And then from 2008, it was communicated with in a different way. And I still don't think that the world of, I think the world of the name of luxury brands is still a tricky one, and we've never really found an alternative for that. But the high-end retail brands, an awful lot of them still have not, we're 12 years on from that moment when broadband came in, and the possibilities that allowed, they still haven't really resolved how best to deal with that. And they're still struggling with this thing of the retail presence and the digital presence, and whether they should be all things to all people, or should they be sort of concentrating on a smaller group and things. And I think that's been a fascinating one to watch, and to try and resolve that, and different people have done that in different ways. Where we are, though, jumping forward to where we are now, so I sold our business in 2010, so it's now a decade ago, which seems quite a long time.
I was thinking about that as you were talking. Yes.
Yeah, and I remained in the consulting roles until probably last year. So I still had very much a sort of a foot in the water with that. But I think it's a very challenging space now, and.
It was interesting. I remember when we started out, and as you say, you were slightly ahead of us, but what appealed, and I think what was marketed in the market, we were seeing luxury in different stages. We actually developed that index of stages, from what was the kind of the product, hard, shiny, status luxury, to, you went through the various stages to number 5, which was more about the emotional, poetic,
life cycle.
life cycle
Yeah.
abstract. And I think, I remember meeting you, and that conversation we had was easy and fairly ordinary. And I remember having the same conversation with the CEO of a French luxury brand who had quite a lot of traction in Russia at the time, and also in UAE, and he completely pushed back against it, and found the whole notion that luxury was other than status quite suspicious and abhorrent. And now I kind of feel that not only have where you've indicated in the way that you looked at the thing, but also now I worry that they are the only things I hear about luxury: the experience, the language, the poetry. And I think, well, actually, I still want a well-made, beautiful piece of cashmere from Hermes, and I still would like, the best leather satchel. And I was reminded recently that I got the chat from a salesperson at one of the LVMH, their big retail stores, and the thing fell apart in 6 weeks. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I just heard them talking about product and praising product and the focus on product? And I thought it was interesting that now with the reset, this is happening. I've seen 2 things, and I'm wondering, have you noticed this, just reflectively on it, that there is a focus again on the product as hero or heroine. So back to understanding this essential thing, I really am going to get the best of it. And then around that, this really elevated sense of service. Or do you think that's just me being fanciful, and that's not?
No, not at all. And I think it's reflected in, here we are speaking to each other from probably our homes, as most conversations are now. And I'm certainly, we can talk about my newer stuff in the meantime, but I mean, we're seeing it in the way that people are suddenly, they're nesting, and I think whether they're spending on their homes, their garden, their art, but then you come back to whether it's the clothing or the sort of watches or the leather goods you might have around you. You think, well, I'm buying and shopping less. And I was in London yesterday, which is a sort of rare, I'm only there every few weeks now. And I'm thinking, and you want to go and support people, and it's there's a pleasure still to sort of go into places, but we are buying less. And I think we want to buy better. And so I went in to see the guys at Connolly, who are one of the ones I've retained a good connection with, and they are still utterly product focused in what they do. And it was so lovely, to go into a place like that, and there's still some wonderful designs coming out and new fantastic product, and it was such a pleasure to sort of interact with them and hear about their new things. And that made you think, yes, no, that is what I want to have around me, and I don't want cheap junk, and I want.
Yes, here, yeah.
And for me, more than ever, the story is important, and the provenance is important, the design is important, and the way it's sold to me is important. I think it's the things that, ironically, we were talking about back in the late 90s, which are, for me, more important than ever. And
I guess we assumed, I think, at the time that the product was okay, in the sense that it was done the way it should be done, with perfection, with focus, with that sense of care and beauty, and that the artistry that you expect in luxury. And I guess, given that we believe that was the case anyway, the other bits we were, I guess, challenging and suspicious about, the experience, the luxury. And I remember you spoke at one of our events in Australia, and you at that point had embarked, I think you'd started on a new part of your career where you were looking at landscape and photography and gardening. And it oddly, and again, I always think these things are serendipitous, because it didn't seem at odds with what you had done. Because I always think when you look at those bigger issues, it is about reflection. It is about the artistry. It is about understanding the story. And so while people were saying, gosh, James has gone off to do these things, I was thinking, isn't that a natural development to where you started out from? Or was that me simply trying to provide you with a connection?
No, funnily enough, I think it was ahead of us talking, that did cross my mind, that talk, where I did make some quite overt references to and it was the brands who were using things which had a fundamental appeal and how important that was, whether it was in there. And I think I remember putting up, there were shots of an Aesop store which had there's like a sort of cabin interior. There were different kinds of advertising that referenced whether it was car companies or watch companies or whatever. There were a surprising number of references throughout the brand message of a number of brands which I really liked, which actually talked about timeless and often natural and, I don't know, quite universal themes. And I was, I think, trying to encourage that and sort of applaud that. And yes, it's something that's always been very close to my heart. And I think I'd always seen that as being something which had always been part of the brand message. And here we are talking a few moments ago about sustainability and how that's suddenly back on the agenda. And that's all part of it, that, you know, whatever it is you're buying, you actually want to know that it's long lasting, it's not doing damage, it's been well handled, it's supporting good people, it's, you know, all these nice things that are entirely possible for a brand that thinks carefully about what it does.
I guess if you think about the areas you've moved into now, I always think about, you know, in fact, yesterday I was having a chat with Marcus Fairs, the editor-in-chief of Design magazine. Yeah. And he was saying that, you know, design pervades everything. And we'd actually touch on the issue of landscaping, landscape gardening, that great, you know, the great gardens, whether they were done to be romantic or whether they were done like in the kind of the Notre style, or whether it's now rewilding, you know, the latest kind of manifestation. That design plays either a very tacit or explicit part in the process, whether it's designed by accident or designed by intention, that we're still having to design these things. And I just want you to maybe to reflect a bit on how you see your work in this area. How would you describe yourself, and what are the things you're trying to achieve as you move forward and perhaps away from the areas of luxury that you were previously focused on?
I think I had, by the time I basically sort of brought my luxury sort of strategic consulting sort of work to an end last year. I mean, I did that partly for practical reasons because I just had a lot of landscape work. But it was for me, it was a sort of natural transition. I felt I had loved what I did in the brand arena, but I felt it suddenly was time to hopefully leave a more lasting impression in a different area. Landscape had always been a very dear part of my makeup, I guess. And what can I say about it? I
mean, do you think it reflects on you as a person, or you as where you came from in terms of the, you know, the business you'd set up? Because I was curious about, I was chatting recently to, I said, well, I wasn't sure if they were a farmer, because this is my question in my head, were they a landscape gardener? You know, they'd started rewilding quite vast tracts of East Anglia. And I was saying, well, do you see that as a farming issue or as a landscaping issue? And they were saying, gosh, we've never thought about that. They said, well, actually, it's probably both. In some ways, you know, we're farming the land better and more effectively in some ways, but we're also trying to reestablish a core sense of beauty to an industrial landscape. So I thought it was really interesting that a farmer was thinking about these things. I mean, what are you thinking about?
I do have this very strong feeling. I'm on a bit of a mission in a way, and I know my contribution is probably only going to be sort of chipping away at the edges of this, but I hope there are other aspects are going to follow in terms of whether it's a book or other forms of communication. But I do think and feel that particularly in this world we're in at the moment, and since things started to go a bit nuts in 2008 with the sort of digital world suddenly just sort of taking off, we need some balance. We need an antidote to the digital craziness. And for me, so the themes that I talked about in Sydney have become even more important to me. And I think that's what I suddenly felt I felt I had a more important job to do in that arena. And that although certainly patronizing a very responsible brand which does things right with the right materials and in the right way with the right people is a good thing to do. I wanted to do something a bit more proactive, and so what I feel and what you can do with whether it's whichever style of the sort of landscaping is, but I mean the rewilding, I guess, is the slightly more overt version of it, is actually connecting people to something that not just really matters from a sort of climate or philosophical point of view, but actually from their very survival and well-being. And we're in a world now where, you know, people are losing connection with so many things that matter. And I worry terribly for the generation that's coming up beneath us, you know, so those who are in their teens and 20s, who are much more deeply immersed in the digital world than we are. And you read these horrendous statistics about the hours spent on screens and things. And I can't remember if in Australia where I quoted a sort of a figure, but I certainly, there's some talk I did recently where I did, and it's awful, you know, the number of hours spent in front of screens. I think in America it's something like 10 or 11 hours a day out of your 24 hours on
so little.
A phone. Well, and it's probably more now. That's probably a few years out of date. And everything that sort of then happens as a consequence of that in terms of health and mental state and everything else you can think of. And there's almost a responsibility, I feel, that if you can, you should be doing something to redress that. And yes, so, and I mentioned someone like a sort of Connolly brand. I mean, they're doing it in their way. I had another lovely brand I'm seem to be becoming a little bit involved in, which do you remember Alex Wilcock, who ran the Nest?
Yeah.
He helped me with the Luxury Briefing rebrand for a while, and we reconnected quite recently. He's running something called Maker and Sons, which have you come across them?
I have indeed. Yeah, in fact, he used to live in my basement at one point, and left me some chairs, which I still have.
Very nice. Well, his new business, Maker and Son, which he's doing with his son, and they've been doing that for a couple of years, and it is going unbelievably well. But it has this, and it is the most comfortable furniture in the world, and I can vouch for that fact. But the whole brand message, which we'll have to look at later in terms of the way they do it on social and the way they cut out the middleman, so there's no retail presence, it just goes straight to you. But the way that things are built and designed and the sustainable angles of it, I mean, it is clearly connecting with people in a fantastic way. And I think there are so many messages from that for other brands out there about how they need to rethink what they do. And I'm almost sort of laughing as I watch his things, because there are these, the videos and things are, furniture literally set in fields, and there are things happening out in the woods and sort of stuff. I mean, it's just so absolutely on message for me, and a completely direct connection with the stuff that I'm doing and worrying about and thinking about. And it makes me very happy to see that is being well rewarded in terms of the customers. And
I would say that it's looking at lockdown, but I think before that we had a push towards, so for example, architects are talking about biophilic offices and biophilic buildings, so that, the intrusion of nature or the welcoming of nature into the building. I was looking at some stats on the sale of plants, potted plants and balcony plants, and
stuff.
Like just going, berserk. And in fact, I looked at the number of startups by millennials and Gen Z in the, direct-to-home plant sector, which I wasn't aware that there was one. And suddenly you go, there's new box designs that arrive, replenishment plans, plants of the day, plants of the week, plans to make you happy and sad. And I thought, for once, I think what's happened is, as somebody says, things are always there, but something happens that makes us connect differently. And I think currently with nature, it's no longer seen to be other. It's now seen to be a core part of. So where we used to visit it, now we're trying to pull it into us. We're trying to get it as close as possible.
Sure, and that's absolutely why I, as you said, yes, I do not feel I'm doing this little occupation way over there, which is nothing to do with, you know, it's a rather sort of random tangent. I actually think have by good fortune have ended up in an area which is actually of very much of the moment, and I think is going to be more and more important as people sort of wake up to the importance of it. And so it's been sorry.
No, I was going to say, so just if I ask you to look at, I'm going to take you into the future now and say, looking at, you know, 5-10 years on, what would you like to see? How would you like to see things change that would reflect perhaps some of the views that you have, and would like to see those shared in a, you know, with a wider audience and I guess a more discerning public?
I guess there's probably two things. I mean, one is from a brand perspective, because that is obviously, you know, what you're about. And I think I literally would go back to some of the content of that talk in Australia, and I'd love to revisit that. I must reread it actually, but I think that is going to be more true than ever when you look at the brands out there. And I'm thinking particularly, of course, things like car companies sort of come to mind, which have got a huge headache ahead of them in terms of means of propulsion, their general acceptability, their impact on the environment, the unresolved arguments about batteries and electric vehicles and the development of cities and things, and the question of ownership. I mean, are we going to be owning those vehicles in 10 years' time? And I'm extremely glad I'm not running a car company, because I think, you know, you're having to think 5 years ahead of the game. But they've really got to embrace the whole environmental side of things in a major way. But I think that applies to a lesser extent to other brands too. They need to think back down their chain of supply, and whether it's the materials they're using. And I know we've talked about all this for many years, but it's going to become much more at the forefront, I think, of things. And you just look at the last year of, you know, what's forgetting all the other crap that's going on in the world with disease and politics and everything else. But the climate side of things is really not very good. I mean, when you look at just the fires and the floods and the storms, and it's suddenly, in a very short space of time, something that a few years ago looked like you'd be 2040, 2050, and it's happening right now. The place is on fire, you know, and I think that's going to continue, and people are going to be looking more and more at their impact and contribution to that. So I think that's one thing. And then there's just the second, the landscape thing itself. And yes, I'm sort of, I have probably like many other people, a sort of file into which I dump lots of interesting articles and clippings, and I have notebooks and things. And at some point in the near future, I will try and actually assemble these into a coherent, and which I know we've talked about this, but and I definitely want to do that. And I'm not quite sure what form that's going to take, whether it's going to be a philosophical paper or something more practical. But what I said earlier about this thing of the healing side of things, I think is really important, and we're going to wake up to that soon. Of course, some people are aware of it already, but there's an awful lot who aren't, and it's how you get the next generation excited about that and building it into everything, and just, I don't know, stopping so many of the destructive things that we have been doing. And I see there are many reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of good stuff happening out there, and I think it's just hoping that becomes a bit more mainstream.
Perfect. So I'm going to ask you now to ask me a question, because I think
I've got two questions for you, actually.
Perfect. So I was going to say, I've agreed with you all the time, and I hate agreeing with people in principle.
Okay.
All
right, my two questions, which I've had little advance notice of, so I've been thinking about this. They're two quite simple ones. What has surprised you most when you look back to when you started, and what is, forgetting sort of temporary issues like COVID and things like that, but in terms of the sort of the brand landscape, what has surprised you most here 20 years on that you either never thought would happen or had just never crossed your mind?
I think the key surprise is how long it takes people to instigate change. Because I guess I spend my time looking at things ahead of time, and therefore to me the change has already happened. Then I've learned over time to broker the time between me thinking about it and it arriving in the public consciousness of the mainstream, and then also becoming part of the wider debate. So I remember in 1995, before Future Laboratory, we were editing a magazine called Viewpoint.
Yeah.
Myself and Chris were looking at issues on, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, what we call the FUD factor,
Yep.
that general belief that was beginning to settle in. We looked at a thing called consumerism, which was about the notion of consumers thinking with a humanist mindset. And we then also looked at the notion of civic brands, that the idea that brands shouldn't be there for profit, but should be there for people, and I guess for the planet, and also culture. And all of these things seemed a bit mad. I remember a publisher at the time saying, look, these will never sell. They're just not ideas that will ship, to use David's phrase.
Yeah.
And we stuck with it. And I always think, with all great trends, the first time it's seen as a tragedy, the second time it's viewed as a farce, and the third time everybody's doing it and wondering why they haven't done it before. And I think that a lot of those early themes have now come into being. And they're not just regarded as eccentric, but core value propositions that brands need and businesses and governments need to think about. My worry, and this is something that I have now started questioning, having talked this talk for quite a long time, is that when I talk to customers, particularly people like millennials, for example, and Gen Z, they are of the opinion that things like our moral framework, our ethical anchors, our sense of social responsibility could and should be decided by brands. Because they are slightly disenfranchised with government and the notion of government, they feel that, well, actually, a brand is in a better position to do this. And to me, this is abhorrent, that we should leave anything up to brands to decide. And in fact, I'm now almost getting back to the position that brands are there to make good products, to make some money, and to do as little damage to the environment. But I don't want them involved in my purpose, and I don't want them involved in my ethics, and I certainly do not want them using their positioning to create moral frameworks within which we should be absolutely.
Well, of course, the most scary extrapolation of that is the likes of Facebook, of course, which now are controlling our politics and our future, and that's really not what it was designed to do.
And that's the bit I suspect will be the next battleground for at last, because politics have become such a great, interesting thing. I remember when I moved to, when I was in Ireland, the only thing you talked about around a dinner party or a table was politics. And when I moved to England, the only thing you were allowed not to discuss was politics. And now I find that actually I can be Irish and English in the same room because everybody is talking politics, because we understand it's a fundamental positioning we need to take if we're going to change things. So whichever side we sit on, it's important we participate. And I think the brand thing is now becoming a positioning that people are choosing because it gets them off the hook. We can't vote for brands. We can't really demand transparency or regulation on the rule of law. And I think all of these things are about what we should be thinking in the future. And that's the bit that I would hope the next 20 years will mean more participation, more involvement, less acceptance, more challenge, and also more solution. That we are not allowing Facebook to take over the public position. It is a social network used to maybe hook friends up and flog a bit of stuff on the side, but really it should not be allowed to become involved in the political moment. So that's my kind of key issue, I think, my beef for the future.
All right. Now my second question, is a fun one for you. What was your worst prediction from those early days?
This is the question that has come up again and again, and I kind of try to think about what.
Sorry for not being original.
No, because it's a really interesting one. I think it's the failed predictions. The obvious one is we didn't predict COVID, and in fact we were predicting, was it going to be a fragmented year because of Brexit, because of the potential of Trump being re-elected, Europe having to reassess its federated systems, but we hadn't banked on a pandemic, which has really thrown everything, off its orbit. I think other things that I think not so much being incorrect, but being overly optimistic about things like driverless cars or electric cars. You
Mm.
know, in my head, I don't understand hybrid anything. I just think, why can't we go from A to C and not bother with the B in the middle?
Yeah.
So I get that wrong all the time because I'm keen to get into the future. And I think other areas where I really didn't predict, as a vegetarian and somebody who eats fish, a pescatarian,
Mm.
I didn't really call the growth at which veganism would hit the mainstream.
Mm.
And I think for two reasons. One, it was, I think it's a generational issue. Gen Z have dominated and driven that particular agenda rightly, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it also fits into a bigger mindset that I perhaps was slightly undervaluing, which is their their views about gender, the views about binary issues, and their
Yeah.
sense that they would reflect the traditions of the parents to some degree. And I think they've absolutely broken with that in a really fantastic and remarkable
Yeah.
way. And a lot of those things that we had sort of put in as a 10% growth or 20% growth have skyrocketed. And the other, on a more, I suppose, practical commercial side, I thought the internet, to use that terrible term that retailers still use when they're talking to me, would just have decimated old school bricks and mortar retail. And I'm amazed that it's hanging on like a desperate swimmer on the edge of a bank with a rushing stream below it, that they're still hanging in there. And I kind of go, why are you doing this? Why not just let go and go with the flow? So again, that's perplexed me. And I think the final bit is I'm slightly always conflicted, to use that American view, about countryside. You know, I love the sea and I love cities, and countryside I've always had an issue with because I'm never quite sure what it's up to. And most of my friends have moved to the countryside and now I have to visit them. I would not have predicted that.
You'll have to come out and see it sometime, Martin.
I
Okay.
might do that, but I have to say, one of my great magazines and the things I look forward to every week is Country Life.
I love to hear that. That would be seen the most unlikely reading for the proprietor of the Future Laboratory.
It is the great, I have to say, it's because it's ecumenical about countryside. It understands the true nature of countryside. Is there's not a theme park or a playground or, you know, a retreat for the idle, whatever, from the city or the lowly paid. It is a living entity. And that's the bit that actually for my next 10 years, I would love to, and in fact, I was chatting to somebody about what would be the ideal village of the future? Where would you build it? You know, the ideal community would be built in the Malvern Hills or built in East Anglia, but to reflect the values of the 21st century. So that's my plan, to rebuild a future community in the heart of Old England.
Good. Well, that's exciting. But there are interesting things going on in that space with, sort of new town planning. There's some good thinkers out there. So
I think there's
I
great.
remain optimistic.
Yeah, I agree. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that will pan out in the future.